All right. So, well, thank you so much for inviting me to give this webinar about some of the work that my group has been doing with seedless table grapes, but also with day neutral strawberry. I'm going to start talking about seedless table grapes and the work that we've been doing for that. So just to give you a little bit of a background on this project and what we were doing, how did we decide to do this project and where this project came about? Since I've been here in Wisconsin, I have been working quite a bit with the grape growers in Wisconsin, but it's mostly all of them are growing wine grapes. I mean, it feels like as soon as those cultivars, those cold hardy wine cultivars came out, there's been sort of like this, there was this explosive growth related to trying to develop like a more of like a wine industry here in the upper Midwest. And so we knew that growers already knew how to grow grapes. And we knew that some of these growers had some table grapes, some of these really older, like seedless table grapes, cultivars such as like Fredonia and Bluebell and King of the North, all of these, cultivars that can survive our Wisconsin winters. So we're like, well, that's interesting. There might be a possibility here to explore whether we could actually expand into not only growing wine grapes, but maybe diversify for these grape growers to grow wine grapes, but also seedless table grapes. And so we also knew that our colleagues at the University of Minnesota had this grape breeding program for cold hardy grapes, and that they also were interested in growing some or developing and breeding for cold hardy seedless table grapes. So those were all the things that started thinking about, well, maybe we should start looking into this possibility. And so what we did is that we started collecting some old data on cultivar trials that we had here in southern Wisconsin, in Madison, and another research station up in Sturgeon Bay. And those places had really old, well-established seedless table grapes trials with these older varieties. And so some of those were about 12 different cultivars that had been planted in 2007. So when I started looking at this data. So there were about 16 cultivars, some of them older than the others. And this is a list of all the cultivars that had been tested. And I did not start these studies. These studies were already in place when I arrived here in Wisconsin at the end of 2014. All of these are older varieties, not all of them had great fruit quality, but they had been evaluated for a long time in these two places. So we decided to just combine all the data and figure out of all of these cultivars that had been tested, which ones are the ones that were doing it the best, that survived the winter, that had the less cold damage, that had consistent yields and good fruit quality, that could have potential for us to recommend to new growers or wine grape growers that would like to diversify. And so we took all of that information, and in addition to that, we took a lot of the information that we had learned by just growing these cultivars for all of this period of time to start thinking about how to design a new project of growing table grapes that would give us better information to scale these to a commercial level. So some of the things that we learned from these initial original trials with older cultivars were to think things about cold hardiness. Many of these varieties simply just did not survive the winter whatsoever, and they die. You can see that image here on the bottom. That's all the result of cold damage, as a vine sort of collapsing in the early spring. We learned about what was the best way to grow them. And so you can see here, this is a training system that's called VSP. This is another training system that is, a combination of a high cordon, but you have 4 cordons. So there was all of the different things that had been tested with this cultivar. So we learned, which ones were the ones that worked the best. We had sort of an idea of disease susceptibility from these older cultivars. And then there was some really interesting studies done on consumer survey the person here in the center of this picture was a graduate student in my program, and she did some surveys of consumer preference on some of these cultivars that we were testing. And so we took all of that information and we decided, okay, we're going to do a new trial. We're going to start a new trial. And we got some funding from DATCAP to establish a new vineyard with new cultivars. And what we did for this trial is we selected of all of that list of cultivars that I show you, the ones that did the best, which were Mars, Reliance, Somerset Seedless, and Montreal Blue. Of all of the ones that we're testing, these were the ones that consistently produced yields and had the least amount of cold damage and had good fruit quality, and we liked them. And then in addition to that, at the same time, our colleagues at the University of Minnesota in their breeding program had some selections that were very promising, and they asked us to include them in our trial. So we had 3 selections from their breeding program. What we learned is that these cultivars, very similar to the wine grapes, grow the best in a training system that is called high cordon, which is basically formed with a trunk or a double trunk, and it has 2 cordons that are established at about between 5 to 6 feet high on the wire, and that allows all the new shoots to grow downwards. That reduces the amount of labor. These cultivars like to grow in that more, downwards position for the shoots. And so this was the best training system, and we decided we were going to implement this for the new vineyard. And then in addition to that, we wanted to add more locations. So we established this trial at Bayfield, Richland Center, Chippewa, Sturgeon Bay, and Spooner, in addition to the one that we had here in Madison. And then the first one that was established was actually the one in Madison. We established it in 2018, 2019. And that had 5 cultivars, and we included only 2 of the Minnesota selections. And I'll be showing data from this specific trial here at the West Madison Research Station, because it's the oldest one and the one that we have been able to collect the most amount of data. All the other locations that I listed here were planting in 2022. So this is going to be their 4th year. And so we're hoping to get some good yield data from those locations. So as we're doing this, in 2025, our colleagues in Minnesota actually released this Seedless Stable Grape series. And so they recently released what they call the Northern Glow Grape series for seedless stable grapes. And there's 3 cultivars that are out there. Lumiglow, which is one of the cultivars that we have. The selection number was the MN 1369, Emberglow 1296, and Shadowglow 1325. So the ones that we still have at the West Madison are the Lumiglow and the Shadowglow. I will be referring to them by their selection numbers because that's how we've always referred to them. Just right now, they happen to have actually a commercial name, and these cultivars are available. And I'm not going to share that information, but if you want information about where you can buy these cultivars, we can provide you that information. So that's great that we were able to test them and now they're available. So let me tell you a little bit about how we established this vineyard. So as I said before, this vineyard is on a high cordon training systems. Here you can say where I was referring to. These are a double trunk in this case, and with one cordon that goes on one direction and another cordon the other direction. The height of these cordons is about 5 feet high, and the vines are on a 10 feet by 7. So each cordon is about 3.5 feet, and we have about 14 spurs in the entire vine. And we've been pruning these cultivars with spur pruning, and we leave about 1.5 buds per spur. So that's the general setting. Here's how it looks of all the different locations that we have. And as I said, I'm going to be presenting mostly about the location in Madison. And here are the different cultivars that we are growing. And so this is just to show you how they look in the map. We're obviously really interesting to get some data from these sites because they're so much colder than we are here in Madison. So that's going to tell us about how well they're doing there. Let me tell you a little bit about the cultivar, some information. So Shadow Glow, which is from the University of Minnesota, is a black seedless table grape. It has a very snappy texture and sort of like a mild tart flavor, a little bit as a blueberry. It's really an explosion of flavor in your mouth. This is a wonderful grape. It's really hardy to zone 4. It has sort of like a moderate vigor. And the resistance for disease is quite good. It has some medium resistance to the most common diseases, but then is actually highly tolerant of some of the most difficult diseases that we deal with. Disease control is a big problem for grape production. So having these cultivars from the University of Minnesota that have some disease resistant really alleviates a lot the pressure to have to be spraying fungicides, because it's really hard to grow them organically because of the high disease pressure. It ripens about mid-September. Maybe this is one of the latest ones that we have for our table grapes. The next one is what they call, it's called Ember Glow, so 1296. This one, we don't have it in Madison. This is more of a red seedless table grape. It has a really crispy texture and fruity. It has a little bit of a strawberry-like flavor, and it's very attractive for fresh market appeal. Again, hardy, very similar to the previous one, to zone 4, and this one has a little bit of a moderate vigor, and it's also moderately to highly resistant to many of the diseases, and it ripens in early September. The next one is the Lumiglow. I love this cultivar. It's great. This is a green-yellow seedless table grape. When you have clusters that are really exposed to the sun, it tends to be like a little bit gold. It develops this beautiful gold color. It's very aromatic. It has this sort of like tropical profile of pineapples and strawberries and guava notes. It's just really good. And it has this, as I said, this really beautiful green and sometimes gold color that is very attractive for fresh sale. It's hardy to zone 4, has a moderate vigor, and again, very similar to the other 2 Minnesota varieties, it's also moderate to highly resistant to disease. It ripens a little bit earlier. This cultivar is ready about late August. And then this is one of our oldest cultivars. This is Somerset Seedless. Maybe many of you are familiar with that. This is an Elmer Swenson cultivar. And so this is not a new one. This was in the original trial that we have. It's a redless seedless table grape. It's a very sweet, and it has also a little bit of this strawberry taste. It's firm, and it has this juicy texture, and it's great for fresh eating, but also for making jelly. It's actually hardier than the other Minnesota cultivars. It says that it's harder to zone 3, and we have had really good results, very little cold damage in this cultivar. It's moderately vigorous, and it ripens in early August. It's grown not only in northern climates, but that's the recommendation, and that's more or less when we are starting to harvest it. This is probably one of the first ones that we harvest in our trials in Madison. Then we have Reliance. This is interesting because this is a cultivar from the University of Arkansas. It has this kind of like reddish pink to deep red color. It depends on whether the clusters are inside of the canopy, on the outside of the canopy, how much color you develop. So there's a little bit of variation, and sometimes customers might like this. On other cases, that not all the clusters are exactly colored might be a problem. So really good light interception by the clusters is very important, and that requires a lot of canopy management to be able to get all of the clusters to ripen at about the same time and have the same color. It's again, a sweet cultivar. It has a little bit of the Labrusca type flavor as a background, so something a little bit like Concord, a little bit of that flavor. It's hardy to zone 5, and it's moderately vigorous. And again, the ripening is in mid-August. And that obviously depends from year to years. Years that we have warm years with a lot of sun, things will ripe earlier. And then the last one that we had is Mars, also from the University of Arkansas. This is a more of a blue-purple seedless stable grape. It has, again, the flavor has a little bit of this Labrusca Concord taste and, taste profile. It has a slip skin, so basically means the skin detaches from the pulp itself. It's hardy to zone 5 to 4. This tends to be a lot more vigorous, meaning the vines produce a lot of biomass, and the ripening is in early September. This one of the characteristics of this cultivar is that it produces really large berries. The berries are really big, which is kind of different from all the other ones that we have. So that's when it comes to the description of the cultivars. Now what I wanted to show you is what is the data that we've collected over the years. So what I have here is the total yield in pounds per vine. You can see there our first harvest was in 2022, and then we have 2023, 24, and 25 that we harvest them. The first year, harvests was not that much because those vines were relatively young. But in 2023, we had sort of like a bumper crop. We had a lot of fruit that year, and you can see that some of the older varieties, such as Mars, Reliance, and Somerset, produce more than the ones from Minnesota. And the reason for this is like the ones from Minnesota were actually planted a year later, so they were a little bit younger. So it's kind of unfair to compare them that way. Then in 2024, we had an interesting year because we actually did have some frost damage that year. And so that really reduced the yield. And also, I think that the fact that we're coming from a year that we had a heavy crop really affected our bud fruitfulness. So we didn't have as many clusters in 2024 because vines were probably very kind of exhausted of having this big yield. And then in 2025, yields, again, we didn't consider that the yields were a lot more moderate. And so in general, what we see is for the 4 years that we have evaluated, that we just don't have yet a kind of like a consistent story about how much yield we can get from this cultivar. So we just need to keep collecting data. We'll see what happens this year. But in general, we see that the yields tend to be around about, in average, very grossly, about 10 pounds per vine. When you extrapolate this into, the next one that we have is the clusters per vine. And so very similar to the trends of the yield. We had this really bizarre situation in 2024 with Somerset Seedless, in which you had a lot of very small clusters, and we still don't really understand why was that the case. But that's the reason why you see this really big, bar here. And then when we go back and we look at the yield is actually not that significant. It's because most of those clusters were very small. And so I wanted to extrapolate the yield per vine to what does it mean in tons per acre. So if we look across what seems to be, the average from all of these, it looks like we would be somewhere around maybe the 4 to 4.5 if you average all of these tons of fruit per acre over the 4 years of data that we have. The other thing that's very, very important is the fruit quality. So we've been, we're constantly taking fruit samples for analyzing them for their acidity content and their sugar content. And so here's sort of like a snapshot of the level of acidity, the titratable acidity of these grapes. Acidity is really important. The combination of acidity with sugar is what really makes something tasteful. So, high acidity does not necessarily mean bad. If you have high acidity with high sugar content, that actually makes it a lot more flavorful than if you have a lot of sugar and no acidity. And so I was talking about this 1325, which is one of these Minnesota varieties, and it has a little bit of more of a tart flavor, and you can see that that's the case, that it has sort of like a higher acidity compared with something like Reliance that tends to have low acidity. And a lot of this has to do with the timing of harvest. The longer you leave them hanging on the vine, the acidity is going to drop. So now between trying to harvest reliance a little bit earlier, because you can see in 2024 and 2025 the acidity is a little bit higher than in 2023, because if not, it gets a flavor, it gets really flat, it's just sweet, and it doesn't have any of that interesting more fruity and strawberry like flavor. So it's a kind of like a combination of, you harvest them based on how well they taste, but then also how much color they develop. So each variety has its little nuances when it comes to management. Here is the average bricks. So this is the amount of sugar content that they have. And as I said before, the 1325, the Minnesota had really high acidity, but you can see also that has really high sugar. So that's what's making it a very interesting flavor. And I was contrasting that with Reliance that had really low acidity, but it has actually pretty good sugar content, which makes it kind of like more like a very sweet, maybe a little bit more flat flavor than some of the Minnesota varieties that have more acidity and more sugar. So what have we learned? We've learned that, we try to harvest somewhere starting in mid to late August, depending on the year. Very important thing that I want to say is that bird netting is a must. You can see here, like a lot of it was eaten. We had, I don't remember if it was the first year or the second year, so much bird damage, because we would put the nets at the same time that we would put them for the wine grapes. But these cultivars have a lot more sugar early on. And so the birds, go for them like right away. So setting those bird nettings and protecting them is really important. The TA values are somewhere between 10 to 18 grams per liter. The bricks, which is the sugar content, between 14 to 20%. And in general, we think, all of these varieties on average produce about 10 pounds per vine. And I said that's somewhere between 4 to maybe 4.5 tons per acre. I put here, I try to calculate for every year the harvest date of these cultivars, how much growing degree days we had. And then you can see that things varied. On the first year of harvest, because there was not a lot of fruit, that fruit ripened really early because there was not a very big crop load. And so you can see with low growing degree days accumulation, those fruits were still pretty good and ready to be harvested. And then the next year, it oscillates somewhere between, 2100 to 2300 is more or less when we've been harvesting them. These grapes and these cultivars, some of them, if you wanted to, you could do multiple passes of harvest. So you could do one pass to take all of the fruit that is more colored and more ripe, and then you can do a second pass in which you would take a second collection of clusters that have spent more time in the vine and develop more color. So you have sort of consistent fruit quality and color, which seems to be very important for this type of grapes. So we still have a lot more to learn in terms of, how to harvest them, when to harvest them at different times. But so far we have had a good experience and collected some really interesting data. The last thing I want to say is that 2023 was kind of like a really challenging season. We started and we went to prune, and we were pruning. You can see these buds that look really like almost like copper, and they're like all shriveled. And that's because we had some cold damage. And you can see here some of the damage. And I was like, oh my God, we're not going to have any grapes this year. But one of the things that we learned about these cultivars, especially the Minnesota cultivars, is that they have a lot of buds that is what we call adventitious buds or non-count buds that will break when the main buds are damaged. And those shoots, actually, many of them carry clusters. So this is a picture of all the fruit that we actually harvested that year. So that year we had like a huge crop. And I think some of the reasons for that is that because our spurs were damaged, we left so much of these adventitious non-count buds grow. And we had a lot of fruits that were coming from them, and we actually had a bumper crop that year. So that's important because depending on the pruning style that you're doing, this will require you to maybe come back and remove some of these non-count buds to be able to have a moderate or an adequate crop load. So that's something that we've learned over the years. So now we prune and we leave less count buds because we know we're going to get some fruit out of these non-count buds. So I think that this is probably the last slides that I have for this part of the talk. So I don't know if we want to answer questions now.
Yeah, let's just pause for a few minutes. There's one question in the chat. Can you repeat the spacing at which you planted the vines at the ag research stations?
Yeah, so the space in between rows was 10 feet, and then in between vines on the planting row, 7. So each cordon was 3.5 feet long.
Great. Any other questions out there about grapes?
We can always answer more questions at the end also.
We just had another question come in. What are the bloom times of the Northern Glow varieties?
They all actually have almost the same bloom time. We haven't identified certain cultivars that bloom before the others, and that depends on the year. But in general, we see bloom somewhere in late May. Sorry, no, in actually early June. So in late May, we start seeing, break and growth. We don't see much difference between cultivars when it comes to bloom, to the opening of the flowers in the clusters.
Okay, another question here is, I'm not sure I understand it. It's, would you recommend Scott Henry divided canopy to improve yields?
The problem with the Scott Henry, it's a wonderful training system. We test them for many years for our wine grapes. The problem is that it's a lot of labor because you have a pair of cordons that has those shoots going up and a pair of cordons that have shoots going down. The shoots that are going down, no problem. They naturally go down. But these cultivars tend to have more of this droopy, growth habit. So you constantly have to be tucking in all of the shoots are coming from the top cordons. And that requires a lot of work. The other thing is, it's more pruning, it's more canopy management during the growing season. You will get more yield for sure. But then also I think that there's certain capacity from these vines. So we haven't yet figured out how much you can crop them without affecting the timing of the ripening, the color development. And so my sense from all the years that I've been working with them is that they have a little bit less of vine capacity compared to the wine grapes. Because one of the differences is that you want a relatively nice size of a cluster because you're going to sell them for fresh eating. In the case of the grapes, it doesn't matter if in the case of the wine grapes, it doesn't matter if the clusters are a little bit smaller. You're going to crush them. You want the quality of those berries to be to a certain level to make good wine. So I'm not sure that I would want to use that training system and just like heavily crop them because I think it would potentially affect the quality and the size of the clusters. That said, I have not tested it.
All right, another question. Could you repeat the pruning information and why it works better to prune so severely?
Because if you don't, okay, so our pruning style is what we do spurs, so spur pruning. And as I said, we had about 14 spurs per the entire vine, so 7 spur in each one of those 3.5 cordons. Each one of those spurs, we would leave on average 1.5 buds. So that means some spurs have one, some spurs have 2. So we were trying to balance it. If we leave more buds, those are going to produce more shoots that carry more clusters. And that is maybe like too much for these vines. And then also it creates a very shady canopy. And one thing that we've learned is that for having good color development, we need to have direct exposure of these clusters to the light. If not, you ended up, look at Reliance. You can see in this image in Reliance, the cluster on the right side is a cluster that was on the outside of the canopy with a lot of light. The cluster in the middle and the cluster on the left, you can see some of those green berries. They're sweet and nice to eat, but they just don't have the color. And so that, for a consumer point of view, that might not be ideal. So leaving too many buds is going to result in too many shoots with too many clusters, and that might affect the uniformity of the clusters and the timing to ripen.
All right, another question here. If I were to change grape varieties, do I have to dig up the old roots?
We usually recommend to take as much as possible. We don't think that I haven't seen grapes with replant disease. If you're trying to, you're going in that direction, as we see when we replant apple trees or peach trees or other trees. So these vines were actually planted in the same spot in which we had our older trial, and we had no problems with that. So yes, you want to remove some of those roots, but you are not so concerned that you might have replant disease, because I've never seen those on grapes. You can plant in the same spot.
Okay. Can I plant a variety, and do I need to have distance between them? I have a small space.
Yes, you can. They're all self-fertile. You don't need cross-pollination for any of that. So you can just plant one single variety on a block, and that will be fine.
Okay.
While Dr. Atucha is going to answer maybe one or two more questions, I'm going to throw up a quick demographics poll. We, as we're recipients of federal funding, we're required to show that we are reaching parity with the census. And so this is totally voluntary and anonymous, but I'm going to throw it up there for a few minutes. You can still talk and she can still answer questions. But if you would answer it, we would appreciate it.
Yep, and let's just do another couple questions, and we can hopefully get to the rest of them at the end. So the next one is, are you constantly pruning leaves away from grapes all season?
No. What we do, we try to minimize. I mean, we don't have time. So we try to do the most efficient canopy management task. So what are those? We do some really good pruning, and we make sure that we are sanitizing as we're pruning, making sure that we're removing all of any potential spurs that have signs of disease, and keep everything clean and well pruned. That's the first one. The second one is that when the shoots are maybe, somewhere about 3 to 5 inches in height, we go out there and we look at, for each spur, if we had left 2 buds, that we would assume that in each one of that, we would have 1 shoot and 1 shoot. So 2 shoots in that specific position. If we have some of those non-count buds or adventitious buds that are also breaking, we make sure that we remove them. And so we want to make sure that we keep, if we have 7 spurs, we want to have somewhere between maybe 14 and a maximum of 20 shoots. We keep some shoots just for replacement in case, but we don't want to have 7 spurs with 14 buds and have that result in 25, 30 shoots. That is going to make the canopy really shady. So we do the shoot removal at that stage. And then the other thing that we do, if we need to, we go during the growing season and we comb some of the shoots that might get tangled up, and we just bring them down. But that's all we do. So we actually don't do leaf removal around the clusters at all.
Okay.
If you have the time, you could do it, but it's a lot of work. And for a commercial scale, it's just too much labor.
Do you fertilize the grapes?
Actually, we don't. Not in this particular spot. And the reason why we don't is because we have really, really fertile soils. And for a very long time in the old vineyard that we had with the old varieties, which is in the same spot where we have this vine, we used to put mulch, so chips, hardwood chip mulch, and over the years, that study received a lot of those chips, and they start breaking down and decomposing and releasing nitrogen and releasing minerals. So in addition to having a fertile soil, we have had all of those chips that have been contributing to even more nutrition. Now, if you are going to plant them in a site where you have maybe more sandy soils, or you have, soils that don't have a lot of organic matter, then you will have to assess the growth of the vines. You would have to measure, one good indicator is the length of the shoots, how long those shoots are. If you have, shoots that are anywhere, maybe shorter than 3-4 feet long at the end of the growing season, you might want to think about fertilizing. So we are not fertilizing them, but in many sites you would need to fertilize them with NPK. And if you have a nutrient deficiency, you would also, a micronutrient deficiency, you would probably also have to provide some micronutrients. This will usually be a fertilization that you would do in the spring.
Okay, great. So we'll try to get to the remaining questions after the strawberry presentation, but we need to move on. So let's dive into.
Okay. Perfect. So let me tell you about this project. I'm gonna mostly talk about a project that we did several years ago on growing day-neutral strawberries, organic day-neutral strawberries. And so I'm gonna go again through the background and how we came up with this project and where we were doing this project. So one of the things that we were thinking about is, we know that a lot of the strawberries that we grow here in the upper Midwest is they're June bearing, and so these are perennial systems that produce a big crop and one crop in June. And so one of the questions that we were asking is like, can we capitalize on the high demand for strawberries during July to September by producing day-neutral strawberries? Day-neutral strawberries, the difference with June bearing is that they actually start producing somewhere in July and then continue all the way in the fall until the first frost. So that means you have berries that you can sell during the entire summer. And we did a study, and we did a really interesting survey, and we realized that there was really high demand in farmers markets to have locally produced strawberries during this period of time that goes into the fall. There was some research in the University of Minnesota that had explored day-neutral strawberry production and also had tested several cultivars, and they also seem really promising that there's a window of opportunity there to provide strawberries that was not being fulfilled. We also wanted to know if we could capitalize on the premium prices by producing organic day-neutral strawberries. So not only offering fruit when there's not a lot of local fruit, but also offering organic. And so the project, this new project, was to test if we could produce these organic day-neutral strawberries. And also we wanted to develop budgets that could show like what was the break-even prices that we would need for this specific system. So we were interested about providing fruit in a time of the year where we don't have locally produced strawberries, and also sell them organically. But we did know that one of our biggest limitations to grow organic strawberries was going to be the insects and the diseases. So we knew that in advance. Our colleagues in the University of Minnesota have been growing the neutral strawberries and had a lot of background information. And so when we wrote this grant and this proposal, we knew that this was going to be an issue that we would have to address. So we wrote this proposal. This was a team effort between UW-Madison and the University of Minnesota. And what we wanted to do, the main goal of the project, was to evaluate the feasibility of growing organic day-neutral strawberries in the upper Midwest. Some of the short-term goals that we had was to evaluate yield potential, harvest window, and fruit quality. To evaluate the treatments that I'm going to tell you what were the treatments that we were going to implement, if they could help us mitigate pest pressures in this annual day neutral strawberry production system, and also estimate farm level profitability of organic annual day neutral strawberries production systems. So We actually want to do everything. And we try to collect as much data as possible to see if this would be a potential for our growers to expand the offering of strawberries into, more of the summer and the fall, and then get some premium prices by growing them organically. So, well, I don't know what's happened here. Oh, there we go. Okay, so let me show you a little bit about the system that we had. So we grew them in plastic culture, and the reason for growing it this way is because day-neutral strawberries are they're almost like an annual crop. You plant them in May, and then the plants die at the end of the growing season with the frost. I mean, you can overwinter them, but if you overwinter them and the plants survive, the second year they produce really like few amounts of fruit, not as much as the first year. So the idea is to produce them sort of like a tomato on an annual basis. And because of that, these plants are actually not really good at competing with any weeds. Actually, strawberries in general are not good for competing with weeds. So growing them in a plastic culture just really helps control weeds. And so one less thing that we had to worry about when it comes to controlling weeds in an organic system. This is the size of the beds and how, the width and how tall they were. And this is, you can see a mulch applicator here when we're putting the mulch. We had two sites. We did it in Madison and the same research station where we had the seedless table grapes, and in St. Paul, Minnesota, we had the other site. We had 4 treatments that we were testing them, but we're trying to grow them in different mulches. So we had a black mulch, a white on black mulch, which is the one that you can see there in the picture. We had a reflective metallic mulch, and then we had something that's called a weed guard plus biodegradable mulch. So this is sort of like paper, and it was brown. And we were interested in that because, plastic is a problem, recycling of plastic is a problem. So we're like, wouldn't it be nice if we can actually grow them in something that is biodegradable? So we tested that as well. We used only one cultivar, and we selected this cultivar based on all of the years of research that the University of Minnesota had done already on cultivars of day-neutral strawberries for Minnesota. And so Cabrillo was their favorite. And so we went with only one cultivar so that we could test the different mulch treatments. We purchased all of our plants from a nursery in California. We plant them in double rows. You can see here how, this puncturing here is where the plants are going to be. The planted space was 12 inches within a row and 13 between the rows and plant spacing. So, those are the dimensions that we had. The alleyway were about 23 inches in width, and we plant them with organic annual rye to control weeds. The plants were fertigated, using a drip tape that went under the mulch. So we put the drip before, and then on top of that, we put the plastic mulch. And then we planted in 2022 and 2023. We were able to get into the fields when they had dry, and this was about mid-May is when we started planting. So this is a picture of a ton of, students, undergrads and grad students helping us plant. You can see the irrigation line here on top of the bed. You can see here how we're applying the metallic mulch, the reflective mulch. And then here we have this army of students all planting by hand, establishing all of the strawberry plants that we got from the nursery. These come in dormant plants. So it's just a small little plant with a root system and a crown, and they are dormant when we plant them. Again, here's another picture of how the different treatment looks. Here you can see this is the biodegradable mulch, this kind of like paper, crepe paper, and you can see how the strawberry plants are starting to grow. And that's probably, maybe 3 weeks after we planted. You can see the organic rye that is growing here, and you can see how all the plants are growing in the different treatments. So there's the white, the black, the biodegradable paper, and the metallic mulch. So in terms of management, what did we do? You must fertigate them. You need to provide them nutrients weekly. And so we fertigate them through this drip line that we had, that the emitters were 8 inches apart. We fertigated in the first year. We gave them about 5.5 pounds of nitrogen per per acre per week. The year 2, we decided to double that, and that really increased our yields. So we were not sure about how much to fertilize. We were basing our recommendations on what the University of Minnesota had done, but we learned that we needed more. And so fertigation is a must. For insect control, which was a big problem that we had, the biggest insect we had was tarnished plant bug. That is a big problem, and we used Pyganic and Trust as organic insecticides. For disease control, we didn't see a lot of diseases, but we did have diseases. We used Howler and Regalia as a fungicide, as organic fungicides, and we monitoring for irrigation using tensiometers. We had a couple of tensiometers installed, and then we would always irrigate once the soil matrix potential would drop below minus 30 kilopascals. So this is overall the management that we were applying for this study. Thinking about, all the tasks that you have to do in these systems, it starts in the fall. You need to order your plants to plant in the spring, in the fall. Then in early spring, you need to be thinking about installing your irrigation, your lines. In early May, we started building the raised beds and applying the plastic mulches. In mid-May, we planted. From mid-May all the way to October, we were weekly fertigating and giving them nutrients and irrigating them. From June to August, we were removing runners. These plants want to produce fruit, but they also want to produce daughter plants, and they throw these what we call runners to multiply into new plants, and those need to be removed because they compete with fruit production, so we had to cut them off. We also did some flower removal, the very flush of flower removals, of flowers, we removed them. We did not allow them to become berries because we wanted those little plants to grow a little bit more. Then we learned that really we don't have to do that. So that's a management that we didn't do the second year. And then the harvest went from late July all the way to October. And then by November, before we got any hard frost, we tried to remove all the plastic mulch from the field. So let me tell you a little bit about yield and what we saw. So you can see here, I'm going to briefly tell you, the y-axis is grams of fruit per plant. You have 2022 and 2023. You have here Minnesota on the left and Wisconsin on the right, and then the different mulch treatments, the black, the metallic in blue, the paper in red, and the white on white. And so here's a little summary. This summary is based on assumptions that with the planting density that we had, you had about 14,400 plants per acre. So we have the yields for Minnesota on 2022 and for Minnesota on 2023, and then from Wisconsin in 2022 and for Wisconsin in 2023. And then we have sort of like the average of the 2 years for Minnesota, the average of the 2 years for Wisconsin, and then, the average for combining Minnesota and Wisconsin. So what you can see sort of in general, we did see a much higher yield on the metallic mulch. This is, when you look at Wisconsin in 2023, and then we did not see a statistical difference, but between the metallic and the paper, we actually did see higher yields the first year. You can see that the yield increased substantially on 2023, and that's because we were fertilizing them more. And so this is more or less what we were getting, a little bit over a pound of fruit per plant in Wisconsin, and you can see here the average and the metallic being the highest. And when you look at the pound, what will be this on an acre basis, you can see here there's about almost 2,000 more pounds of fruit in the metallic compared to the black and the white. And then the paper was actually pretty good. We actually saw some good results with the paper. One of the problems that we had is that those were the yields that we got. But what I'm not showing you here is how much fruit actually was non-marketable. And this was a big problem. You can see here, again, this is Minnesota and Wisconsin. This is the percentage of fruit that was unmarketable, whether because there was damage by insects or had some sort of damage. And what you can see is that the percentage are pretty high. So in Minnesota, the first year, it's almost like 50% of the fruit was not marketable. In Wisconsin was a little bit less, but still, I mean, we're talking about like over 30% of the fruit was unmarketable. So this was a big issue that we had. What was it making it unmarketable? Well, we said that tarnished plant bug was our biggest problem, and that's what happens when you have this insect. It, inserts their feeding their mouth into the developing berries, and then they produce this cat facing. We also had some diseases. We had some small fruit that were not well developed, they're not marketable, and then at some point we actually had some frost damage as well. Very late on one of our last harvest of the season. Well, we looked at the total marketable yield. This is more or less what we had per treatment, and then I want to go very simply to look at sort of like the average and try to extrapolate this into pounds per acre, and we see that this is about half of what I was telling you was the full yield. And again, metallic seems to have the highest marketable yield, the highest yield, but also the highest marketable yield. And paper would also come on second place, pretty decent. So let me tell you a little bit about how much it costs these systems. There's a lot of things that you have to consider for, like materials such as plants, the plastic mulchers, the irrigation, the seeds for the alleyway, the fertilizer. You'll need some level of fuels, fungicide, insecticides, and then your harvest containers. There's a lot of labor on site preparation, mulch installation, runner removal, weed management, harvesting, sorting the fruit onto unmarketable and marketable, and then the pest control and the mulch removal at the end of the season. So those are all the things that we considered when we were building our budgets. So here it shows you more or less the material cost, and this is dollars per plant. And so you can see here for the alleyway covered with seeds, how much the mulches cost us, the irrigation and the fertigation. It did not count for insecticide and fungicide because actually we got all of this donated, but this is something that was a little bit of cost, but actually on the very low end. The harvest containers and all of the materials, how much it cost us per plant. So the average for the two sites was about 0.43 cents per plant. Then I want to show you labor cost, and I'm going to highlight a little bit some of the labors. The flower and the runner removal is one of the things that was quite a bit of time spent. This is in minutes of labor per plant. So it was one of our highest time consuming task. Then weed and mowing was also a big task because those alleyways that had the cover crop needed to be mowed. Then we spent quite a bit of time at harvesting. I mean, we harvest every week. We harvest fruit, and then the post-harvest cleanup and winterize was another one that requires time at the end of the growing season. So I'm going to go through this table with the total direct cost, showing you a little bit of cost in the different systems. And again, I'm going to try to go through a little bit of the average here, but if you look at dollars per acre on average, the paper mulch was one of, I show you that it had some good yields on second place, but it actually has quite a bit of direct cost. One of the reasons for this is that we actually did get this paper mulch to break down and tear. So we had to retug them to make sure it was not, coming all out. This was a big problem that they had in Minnesota with a lot more wind in that site. The paper would not hold that well on the bed. And so they spent a lot of time, putting back that paper mulch in place. When it comes to labor cost, we also, that was reflected in the time that was spent on the paper, but you can see they're all pretty similar if you look at the white, the black, and the metallic, besides for the paper mulch because of the issues that I just described. And so something like the metallic produces a lot more fruit, but it has very similar direct cost. And then I just want to show you here, the total direct cost that we were seeing if we extrapolate this to an acre. When we look at the gross and the net returns, these are all the assumptions that we use. We use, again, 14,400 plants per acre. The gross return we calculated as the yield per price, where the yield is measured in pounds per plant. And the price is about $8 per pound. And this price is actually pretty conservative. We ended up with this price after we did a survey of a lot of farmer markets around Minnesota and Wisconsin, in which in some cases, they were charging 12 or 13 dollars per pound. So it's a pretty realistic for day neutral strawberries, locally produced organic strawberries in August and September. The direct costs include the materials, the fuel, and the labor, and the net returns over direct costs is the gross return minus the direct returns. So I'm going to go straight to the direct returns, but you can see here that when we looked at how much money you can make out of these systems after you subtract all of your cost, you can see here anywhere between $13,000 all the way to $30,000 per acre when we consider subtracting all of the costs. So this is net returns. I'm going to just give a summary because we don't have a lot of time. The system is profitable. One of the things that would make it even more profitable would be to reduce labor. One of the things would be to, instead of using a cover crop, would be to use landscape fabric on the alleyway. And you can see here, I'm putting an image. This is an image from upstate New York on a different system, but they do have landscape fabric to not have to deal with the cover crops or the weeds in the alleyway. Maybe reduce runner removal and find some middle point in which you remove enough that it doesn't affect your yield or affects minimally your yield, but consistently reduce your labor cost. Maybe another option would also be to reduce costs by overwintering the plants for a second year of production, though we do know that a second year of production would considerably reduce the yield on the second year if you overwinter them. But then you don't have to plant them again, and you have the entire system set. You just need to make sure that you overwintering the entire system. And the other thing that is really, really important is that we really need to increase the marketable fruit. As I said, we had about 30 or 50% of unmarketable fruit. That's half of the fruit that we produce. So if we can find ways to organically control tarnished plant bug, that could really, increase our amount of marketable fruit. And so one of the things that we could do would be to use some of these exclusive nets that would cover the plants and would exclude the bugs, and also would keep them dry to reduce diseases. And so we produce a ton of resources. Here we have, this is the image of a video that we have on our YouTube page for how to detect diseases. We have all these resources, extension resources that we can share. The University of Minnesota has a ton of resources on this. And then I want to acknowledge that we got funding from NIFA Organic Transition Program. And this was a team effort from our fellows from the University of Minnesota and UW. And just say thank you to a lot of students, LTEs that spent so much time helping us collect this data. It was a lot of work. And that's it. That's all I have, and I'm happy to answer questions.
All right, thank you so much, Amaya. It is 1 o'clock, and I just want to mention that this is recorded. We'll be sharing the recording link. So if you have to hop off, or you just want to dig into that information a little bit more, just know that. But Amaya, if you have just a few more minutes, we have a few questions in the chat.
Yeah.
Is that okay? All right.
Yes.
So related to strawberries, how did you manage SWD?
We actually had no issues with spotted wing Drosophila. I don't know why. We had no problem. That was one of the things that we thought we were going to have to deal with, and we didn't have any damage of spotted wing Drosophila in our site here in Wisconsin. In Minnesota, a tiny little bit, but it was not a problem. Our biggest problem was tarnished plant bug, was not spotted wing Drosophila, which we anticipated it was going to be a problem, but it wasn't.
Another question is, can the runners removed be replanted or potted and sold?
Not that simple. I mean, it's a lot of work. Yes, you could do it, but we're talking about 14,000 plants for an acre. I mean, unless you have a nursery, you're not going to be doing that. You won't be able to do that. Yes, you could potentially let them grow enough that they root and then clip them and put them in soil and propagate them. Yes. I don't think that any of these varieties, I would have to check if these varieties have a patent. If these varieties have patent, you're not allowed to propagate them.
Next question is, what was the dollar amount per hour used for labor costs?
I don't have that from on top of my head, but we actually did publish a paper. So if somebody's interested, I can send you the paper, or you can just look for it. It was a paper that was published on a journal. It's called Hort Technology. And so the economists that work on this project, Gigi Di Giacomo, published all the data there.
We can add that with our follow-up email. We can put the link to that.
Can this be used in alley cropping systems?
I don't know what that means. Is this like, can we intercrop strawberries with, like, I don't know, soybeans? Something like this? Is that what the question is?
It might be referring to like agroforestry systems where you're planting strawberries in between rows of perennial crop. What are you planting?
Well, you saw how we had to get in there with the tractor, put the mulch, all those things. You have to put the irrigation line. I mean, yes, you could, but once you have them in the alleyway and you have any sort of other crop that needs that alleyway for any like sort of like even labor pruning or anything like that, is right in the middle and they're very delicate. So I don't know. Also, one of the reasons where we think that the metallic mulch works so well, and I didn't say this, and had the highest yield and the more marketable fruit, is because there's the reflection of the sun towards the plant. And so the more light the plant is intercepting, the more photosynthesis the plant is doing, the more carbohydrates, the more yield, the more energy and resources it has to develop more fruit. So that's the reason why we think that. We also think that the idea for this metallic was that the light was also going to, affect how insects orient and, kind of disorient the insects in terms of the damage. We didn't necessarily saw that with the tarnished plant bug, but we have seen on other systems in raspberry, when we use these reflective mulches, that's the case for spotted wing Drosophila.
And one more question on the strawberries is, do you have irrigation frequency recommendations for folks that don't have a tensiometer for the minus 30 kPa recommendation?
That is so depending on the type of soil that you have. So you would have to know your soil. If you have a soil that, again, is more into the loam, sandy soil that dries really fast, then you're going to have to probably irrigate in the middle of the summer with high, warm weather, maybe every other day. If you have more of a clay soil and you have also the mulch, the plastic mulch, when you're irrigating and you have the plastic mulch, you are taking out of the equation the evaporation from the soil. You're just having the transpiration from the plant. So that also helps keep the moisture. But if you're having more heavy soils that have a lot more clay, then you probably can space that to maybe once every 4 days. These plants, these day neutral strawberry plants growing these systems, tend to have small root systems, so they'll dry faster. So the only way to know that is that if you were able to, get your hands in there and touch the soil. But if you have plastic, it's kind of like really difficult. So investing in a tensiometer, the tensiometers are not expensive. You can get super, cheap tensiometers. They're not digital. You go and you just look at, at the tension and you read it for like, not much. For way less than $100, you can get a couple of those tensiometers with the classic cup that you just put them in there and that's it. It's very simple technology.
Great.
Oh, thank you, Ari. I can see Ari that is in here. She helped us so much. If it wasn't for her, we would have not done any of this. She was an amazing help, and she knows a lot about the strawberries too.
Thank you.
And we have a couple questions from the grapes that are unanswered. So one is, how long do the different varieties last under refrigerated storage?
Oh, that's an excellent question. We haven't done a lot of that work, but this is anecdotally. I we usually so we have a cold room at the research station, and so we had grapes there for about 10 days to 2 weeks. And if the clusters are healthy, like they don't have any disease, and the berries are intact, you could have them for a good 10 days without any problem to maybe 2 weeks. The problem is that when you bring in clusters and berries that might be split, that just really triggers all sorts of rot happening. But if you have dry instant clusters that are intact, that they don't have any damage, you can keep them for, I would say, between 10 to 2 weeks. 10 days that I was working there.
Great. And one more question about grapes is, can you grow them organically?
Nah, so hard, so difficult, so difficult, like almost impossible. I mean, we try as much as we can to try to bring organic systems. I mean, that's the reason why we're doing these strawberries. It's not because of a lack of interest of growing them organically, but my colleague Leslie Holland, who is a professor in the Department of Plant Pathology, and she was part of she works with grapes, and she works also with the strawberries. She's been trying for years to grow grapes organically for our wine grape growers that want to grow organic. And she has done millions of studies, and it's like almost impossible. The pressure that we have during the summer, the humidity of the summer, and the nature of the diseases that we have make them extremely difficult to grow them organically without affecting the fruit, without lowering the quality. We feel like the best way to go about this is to try to breed, or having these breeding programs breed for cultivars that are disease resistant. So in the case of the table grapes, we are really, really, really enthusiastic about them, because at least the ones from Minnesota tend to have a higher resistance to a lot of our annoying diseases like black rot and anthracnosis. And so we're happy about that, but we still don't think that we would be able to grow them without any fungicide. I mean, organically, with organic fungicides, they just don't seem to work. Not with the pressure that we have, the disease pressure that we have, unfortunately.
All right, I think that covers all the questions. Just want to highlight that Amber put in the chat for grape storage. So 4 weeks, according to Dr. Soon Lee, with the sulfur dioxide pads. But that's all the questions. So yeah, thank you so much, Amaya. And we'll get this recording link out to you all within the next couple days. But thanks for joining us, and look for the other two webinars coming up in March and April. All right, thanks everybody.
Bye.